It was supposed to be a routine morning. Prince William had returned to Clarence House early, seeking a moment of peace before the day began. But within minutes, a royal aide delivered a message that shattered that stillness, a discovery at Royal Lodge. Something hidden, something dangerous, something connected to his late mother. What began as an ordinary inspection had just unearthed a secret buried for decades, and the palace would never be the same again. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. The day had started quietly enough for William. He had been searching for a rare moment of calm, hoping to ground himself before stepping into another long cycle of obligations. Clarence House often felt heavy during the early hours, carrying memories of decisions made, crises managed, and responsibilities inherited. That morning, though, he had hoped to steal a brief moment of stillness before the world intruded again. But peace was never a lasting privilege in the life of a future king. The aide who entered his office carried a tension that spoke louder than any raised voice. William recognized it instantly. It was the kind of tension reserved only for matters that could rattle the entire institution. He set aside the folder on his desk and rose quietly, bracing himself for whatever truth was about to be laid before him. The words were simple, but the meaning behind them was not. A sealed room had been discovered at Royal Lodge during what was supposed to be nothing more than a structural inspection. A forgotten wing, a locked door, a room untouched for decades, and inside boxes that no one could trace. Boxes filled with documents and tapes that should never have been inside Sarah Ferguson's home. Nothing about the discovery made sense, and yet every detail signaled danger. When the aide mentioned the first reference to Princess Diana, something shifted in the room. William's expression did not break, but those who knew him well would have recognized the tightening beneath his controlled exterior. The past had a way of resurfacing at the worst possible moment, and it was resurfacing now with a force that felt almost intentional. The discovery was not just unexpected, it was deeply personal. Documents connected to private royal matters, notes referencing confidential periods of Diana's life, tapes that should never have existed outside the palace's protected archives. It was as if someone had gathered fragments of the most fragile chapters of his family's history and hidden them where no one was meant to look. And yet, someone had looked. Someone had known. Someone had placed those boxes there. William felt the familiar weight of responsibility press against him, the duty to protect his family's legacy, the duty to guard the monarchy's stability, and the duty to face whatever storm was now forming beyond the horizon. Even before seeing the boxes himself, he knew this was no ordinary breach. This was the beginning of something far more dangerous. But what lay buried within Royal Lodge wasn't merely history, it was a weapon, and William knew the monarchy had just been dealt its most intimate threat yet. The room had been forgotten, tucked away behind thick doors, warped by time and sealed shut by dust. It wasn't just abandoned, it had been hidden. When the team entered, they weren't prepared for what they found. Boxes that didn't belong, writings that shouldn't exist, and records that no one was supposed to see. But someone had left them there, long ago, and that someone knew exactly what they were doing. The room was discovered almost by accident. A structural safety team had been dispatched to Royal Lodge for a standard inspection, floor reinforcements, plumbing maintenance, the usual. But as they moved through one of the oldest wings of the estate, a sealed door caught their attention. Warped wood, a rusted lock, dust layered like ash. It hadn't been touched in years. When the door finally gave way, a bitter draft of stale air pushed through as if the room itself had been holding its breath. Inside, time had stood still. The floorboards groaned beneath heavy boots. There were no furnishings, just stacks of boxes crammed into corners, mismatched and disorderly. Some cardboard, some old plastic tubs, others wrapped in what looked like canvas. Labels, where they existed, were barely legible. Most were written in faded ink, the handwriting inconsistent, the names cryptic. A few bore dates: 1989, handwritten notes, some clearly from different authors, chronicled snippets of conversation, private exchanges between Diana and palace staff. Others recounted incidents never made public. A tearful phone call, a heated meeting behind closed doors, questions raised about the influence of certain advisors. Taped audio reels were marked with phrases like KP drawing room or Wales late evening. No one had any idea who recorded them. What's worse, Many of the documents referenced periods of extreme tension, years when Diana's relationship with the monarchy was under siege. Years of personal trauma, institutional isolation, and public spectacle. And yet, someone had gathered those memories, frozen them, and buried them in the walls of Sarah Ferguson's home. That was the question that gripped everyone who entered that space. Why there? Sarah Ferguson had lived through her own maelstrom within royal circles, but nothing about her history suggested knowledge of a hidden archive. And the materials themselves bore no trace of her handwriting, nor her voice. It was as if someone had used her residence, a place less scrutinized than the main palace, as a vault, tucked far from the eyes of security and memory. The discovery was no longer just accidental, it was deliberate concealment. Someone had chosen that room to hide pieces of the royal family's most painful years, and they had done so with a carefulness that bordered on orchestration. The randomness of the box labels, the disorder of the papers, it was all a lie. A layer of chaos designed to mask calculated intent. And while the room whispered secrets, it was the documents inside that began to scream. Prince William has always been composed a future king shaped by duty and discipline. But as he flipped through the documents, his mother's anguish, his childhood stripped bare by anonymous observers, his silence broke. The clenched jaw, the tremble in his fingers, the storm behind his eyes. This wasn't just about betrayal, it was about invasion, and someone had watched far too closely, for far too long. He sat down without a word, the documents stacked neatly before him, as if their presentation could somehow contain their damage. But nothing about what he was about to read would stay contained. The first file, marked only by a scrawled name and date, held a handwritten memo. It was raw, intimate, and utterly disturbing. The author had chronicled Diana's private breakdowns, emotional spirals, desperate phone calls, her fear of being isolated within the very palace walls she once called home. The language wasn't clinical. It wasn't compassionate. It read more like a detached observer cataloging the unraveling of a woman. William turned the pages slowly, each line slicing deeper into old wounds he had fought so long to keep buried. Another folder lay beneath this one, thicker, worn at the edges, marked with initials and vague references to staff titles. Inside were summaries of conversations Diana had with senior aides. But these weren't official transcripts. These were shadows, unverified accounts, twisted recollections, and intrusions that hinted at recordings no one had permission to make. Whoever compiled them had access they never should have had, and a purpose that was never declared. Then came the pages that hit hardest, notes about him and Harry. Unfiltered, deeply personal, and chilling in detail. Their school schedules, emotional outbursts, how they coped after the divorce, written by hands unknown. These weren't innocent observations. They were records of vulnerability, of children trying to survive a public war between parents, all while being quietly observed by eyes they never knew were there. William didn't speak, but those in the room could feel it, the sharp tension in his stillness. He pressed his fingers together tightly, staring down at the words like they might combust under his gaze. When he finally exhaled, it was a long, quiet release. Then, with decisive calm, he ordered that every document be secured under full confidentiality. No copies, no digital records, every page accounted for. Every box catalogued. He demanded a chain of custody report for every item retrieved and called for a security liaison to begin background tracing immediately. This wasn't just archival misplacement. This was a breach of royal sanctity. And as William issued instructions, his voice never rose, but the steel beneath it cut through every lingering doubt he would find out who did this. Because this wasn't simply about Sarah Ferguson or dusty records left behind. This was about his mother, his family, his childhood, and someone had dared to reduce all of that to notes in a forgotten file. But just when William thought he'd seen the worst, a smaller, unmarked box revealed something far more sinister. It was one box. Plain, moments stolen from royal life, pictures that should never have existed. And in the middle of them all, Diana, alone, unaware, watched. The crown's darkest paranoia had just been proven true. The contents inside that final box were unlike anything discovered before. It wasn't filled with papers or tapes, no summaries, no letters. It was heavier, wrapped tight, and encased in aged cardboard reinforced with a second layer of cracked sealant. The archivists unwrapped it slowly, expecting more notes. What they found instead were dozens of photographs, raw, unfiltered, dangerous. At first glance, the images seemed innocuous. But then came the realization these were not public photos. These weren't taken by royal photographers or security teams. These were captured in places that were strictly off-limits. Narrow hallways within Kensington Palace, the rose garden that no one without clearance could enter, secluded spaces known only to the family and their closest staff. And each shot had something sinister in common. Its subject was completely unaware. One image showed Princess Diana in what could only be described as a moment of deep vulnerability. She sat in a room that bore the unmistakable style of her private quarters, eyes cast downward, posture slouched, her expression hollow. It wasn't staged. It wasn't prepared. It was stolen, and it felt like a violation, even to those who had never known her personally. Another photo chilled William to the core. It captured him during his university years, walking through a discreet corridor of the palace, head turned, gaze distant. There was no press around that day. No one had announced his presence. It was supposed to be a rare moment of peace, and yet, someone had been watching. Someone had followed. Harry appeared too young, isolated, in candid frames that carried no joy. The angles were strategic, slightly tilted, shadowed consistent with long-lens cameras or devices positioned without detection. Then came the most damning evidence. Folded beneath the photographs was a slim file. It held diagrams, not of the palace grounds but of its inner layout, complete with markings, circles, notes, arrows pointing to doors and corners and camera mounts. But it was the highlighted areas labeled blind zones that made the room fall into silence. These weren't rough sketches. They were precise, annotated, the work of someone who knew exactly where security watched and where it didn't. For William, it was no longer a matter of historical intrusion. This was a calculated effort to breach the royal family's most sacred walls. These weren't memories, they were proof. Proof that someone had mapped the weaknesses of the palace, photographed its most guarded moments, and hidden the results not in the palace archive, but inside Sarah Ferguson's home. Now it wasn't just about secrets, it was about surveillance, and Sarah Ferguson was next to answer. She had survived scandals, heartbreak, and public disgrace. But nothing prepared Sarah Ferguson for the call that came that evening, a quiet but urgent request to meet Prince William. As she stepped into the palace, memories came flooding back, but this wasn't a reunion. It was an interrogation cloaked in courtesy, and what she was about to hear would shake her to the core. The message arrived discreetly, as palace communications always do, no dramatics, no explanation. But the language was unmistakable. She was needed, urgently, for a personal audience with Prince William. Sarah paused when she read it, not because of fear but because of the tone. It was too abrupt to be ceremonial, too cold to be routine. She had lived long enough within the royal system to know when something serious was unfolding, and this felt like a reckoning. By the time she reached the palace, the air around her had thickened with unease. She walked the familiar halls not with nostalgia, but with dread. The silence that greeted her wasn't out of disrespect, it was precaution. Every glance from staff felt rehearsed. No smiles, no warmth, just eyes avoiding hers and doors opening without a word. William entered the room minutes later. His presence didn't need announcing. He wasn't angry, not visibly, but the energy around him was unmistakably tight. He greeted her politely, but the formality in his voice cut deeper than any accusation. Sarah, for a fleeting moment, wished he had shouted. At least then, she'd know what to defend herself against. Instead, William explained everything calmly, precisely. The inspection at Royal Lodge, the discovery of the sealed room, the boxes, the documents, the photographs. He didn't accuse her. He didn't raise his voice. But every word sounded like the slow ticking of a bomb she had unknowingly been sitting on for years. Sarah's reaction was immediate. Her lips parted, her head shook. "I didn't know," she whispered, eyes wide. "I swear to you, I had no idea that room held anything like that." She looked straight at William, and for a moment it wasn't a former duchess pleading her case, it was a woman blindsided by the past. She confessed that during a particularly dark period when finances were collapsing, and the press was relentless, she'd accepted help from many sources. Movers, organizers, friends, strangers. Boxes had come in, some labeled, some not. She had no reason to believe anything sinister had entered her home. William listened without interruption. His gaze was focused, not hostile, but far from forgiving. Sarah continued, her voice trembling slightly. She remembered one man in particular, a quiet acquaintance from a charity function, who offered to help with storage. He had access. She never questioned him. Why would she? Back then, she was too overwhelmed to see betrayal hiding behind a polite smile. She stopped. Her eyes were damp. Her voice cracked. I was foolish, she admitted. I let people in who I barely knew. And now I fear it's come back to destroy everything. But William wasn't ready to offer forgiveness, not yet. Not when the shadow behind those boxes hadn't been named. The palace archives weren't the only thing being unlocked, so were decades of visitor logs, staffing records, and background files. Royal Lodge had been a revolving door of guests and aides, and somewhere within that endless list was the hand that planted the surveillance. The question wasn't just who, but what they wanted, and if they were still inside the palace. William moved swiftly. After his meeting with Sarah Ferguson, he ordered a complete sweep: 25 years of visitor entries, contractor authorizations, and temporary staff clearances related to Royal Lodge. Nothing was off-limits. Every signature, every car registration, every coded security badge was retrieved. It wasn't just about identifying who had walked those corridors, it was about finding the ghost who'd slipped in unnoticed and left chaos behind. The intelligence team began connecting the dots, focusing on windows of time where infiltration was most likely. They mapped moments of disarray: Diana's divorce, Sarah's financial turmoil, changes in palace leadership. These were periods when the gates were vulnerable, when discretion was lax, and when people with ulterior motives could enter undetected. It was during these windows that the fingerprints of manipulation started to appear. Then came the pattern. Several names showed up repeatedly: not family, not long-term staff, but peripheral figures. Event coordinators, contractors, anonymous couriers. A few of them had associations with journalists known to have ties to controversial royal coverage during the Diana years. Some had visited at odd hours, others without consistent job titles. And though most had vanished from the system, their presence had left digital traces and questions. A forensic examination of the handwriting on the discovered documents further deepened the suspicion. The styles were inconsistent. Some notes bore characteristics of Western European cursive. Others matched Central European penmanship. One set of annotations had characters typical of someone fluent in both English and Arabic. These weren't random scrawls, they were planted breadcrumbs, written by multiple hands, possibly for multiple agendas. Security analysts quietly admitted what no one wanted to say aloud: whoever had orchestrated this didn't just understand the palace's layout, they understood its rhythms, its routines. They knew where to hide, what to observe, and how to avoid being caught. The conclusion was devastating. The mole or moles hadn't been a one-time intruder. They had operated over years, if not decades. And suddenly, the implications grew darker. What if some of these individuals weren't just outsiders, but insiders who had become compromised? Staff turned informants, advisors with private debts or buried secrets. The idea that someone had betrayed the crown from within its own walls was no longer far-fetched, it was plausible. William sat with his lead security officer and his private secretary late into the night. He wasn't interested in blame, he wanted clarity. And that required discretion. The investigation was kept on a strict need-to-know basis. Code-named and sealed. No one outside the circle of trust would be told. Too much was at stake. Not just reputations, but the monarchy's entire sense of safety. And just when the investigation felt like chasing shadows, one final item in the box shifted everything. It was almost overlooked, wedged beneath faded files and barely legible. A single envelope marked with the initials DS inside was a letter not written to a monarch, but about one. It spoke of fears, regrets, and a whispered warning about someone in the royal circle who watched, recorded, and waited. The target? Princess Diana. The watcher? Unknown. But their reach? Unthinkable. The envelope had been tucked deep into the final box, so thin it nearly blended in with the deteriorating layers of paperwork above it. No official seal, no return name. Just DS written in the corner, as if whoever penned it had already said too much with just 2 letters. But inside lay a confession that would twist the investigation into something far more personal and far more dangerous. The handwriting was unsteady but elegant, likely aged, possibly written under emotional strain. It didn't begin with pleasantries or context. It dove straight into shadowed truth. The writer spoke of operations within Kensington that were never sanctioned, never admitted, and never stopped. They referenced rooms Diana often retreated to, places where she believed she was alone. But according to the letter, she wasn't. Devices had been placed cloaked in furniture, buried in walls by someone who was neither press nor foreign spy, but internal, trusted. With access so complete, even palace intelligence didn't question their movements. The letter described this figure in vague, haunting terms: a watcher who said little, touched nothing, but saw everything. No title, no name. But their behavior had become noticeable to at least one person, the author, a royal staff member who began connecting discrepancies during the height of Diana's unraveling public battles. This figure was never seen recording, never caught with equipment. But subtle signs emerged: recollections of conversations that were never supposed to leave a room, timing that seemed too precise to be coincidence, and glances that lingered in places they didn't belong. The most chilling part wasn't what had been recorded, it was why. The author confessed they believed it wasn't for the press, nor for political gain, but something more insidious: leverage. A quiet collection of pain meant to be stored, shelved, and possibly weaponized if ever needed. The tapes, the letter read, were not for headlines. They were for control. William read it twice. The weight of each line thickened the air around him. His mind scanned the timelines. The names. The aides who disappeared without explanation after Diana's death. One stood out: someone who had served discreetly for years, then simply vanished. No obituary, no farewell, just gone. And with them, possibly, the key to unraveling this entire operation. The letter ended not with anger but remorse. "I should have said something sooner," the writer admitted. "But I feared what silence protected." That final line didn't just echo guilt, it warned of something still lurking, something unfinished. With the weight of that confession, William understood this wasn't only about the past. It was a warning, and the consequences were already unfolding. The palace didn't issue a press release. There were no headlines, but inside its walls the ground was shifting. Files locked. Staff shuffled. Surveillance tripled. And William changed. No longer the observer, no longer the restrained heir. He was a man on a mission to root out the rot before it poisoned the crown. And behind closed doors, the reckoning had begun. Everything that followed was done quietly, deliberately, and without a single misstep. On paper, it was a simple modernization effort, a necessary update to internal operations, long overdue. But those within the inner circle knew what it really was: a sweeping purge of vulnerability. William had ordered an overhaul of palace security from the inside out. Blind spots were closed, access points re-evaluated, surveillance routes rerouted. Nothing remained untouched. Rooms once considered safe were reclassified. Storage areas like the one at Royal Lodge would never again be left in the dark. Then came the more delicate part. William reopened files tied to Diana's final years, not publicly, but in complete secrecy. People long retired were approached quietly. Staff who had served her closely, maids, drivers, aides, were discreetly asked to return for confidential interviews. Not to point fingers, but to recall, to reconstruct a timeline that had faded under decades of royal silence. Some remembered inconsistencies, others recounted strange visitors, misplaced items, a sense that things had been watched, monitored. Simultaneously, the household began tightening its walls. A few staff members, still employed but tied to past chapters, were quietly placed on leave. Not dismissed, just removed, while their roles were examined under new scrutiny. No one was accused. No name was spoken publicly, but everyone understood the palace was being sanitized, and no thread of uncertainty would be left hanging. As for Sarah Ferguson, she was approached with measured formality. William extended no punishment, no shame, but he did ask for her agreement, one that would see her move permanently from Royal Lodge under palace guidance. The Duchess, exhausted from the revelation and eager to protect her daughters from further scrutiny, accepted. The arrangement was labeled a health retreat. In reality, it was controlled exile. All of it was logged under a new classified record. Its name was chosen by William himself, Operation Shadowmantle, a title that spoke to the weight of the secrets uncovered and the darkness that had quietly wrapped itself around the institution for far too long. This wasn't damage control, it was containment, and William vowed to seal it tighter than any crown jewel vault. But even with the palace locked down and the investigation underway, William couldn't shake one question: how many more secrets lay hidden, waiting to be found? The investigation isn't over. The files remain locked, the photographs hidden away. But the fallout has already begun. William walks differently now, sharper, more watchful. He knows what few do, that the enemy once stood among them, smiling, trusted. And in the shadows of the palace, the past breathes, waiting, watching. And one day soon, it may rise again. He thinks of her often now, his mother. Her voice, her instincts, her paranoia. Back then, they said she was dramatic, too emotional, too suspicious. But she wasn't wrong. She had sensed it. The quiet eyes that followed. The silent halls that carried more than just whispers. Now William sees the truth with devastating clarity. Diana had lived in fear not because she was fragile, but because she was surrounded, watched, tracked, and in the end, left too vulnerable by those who were meant to protect her. In the weeks following the discovery, William met with his father. The king had been briefed in confidence, and together, they reached an unspoken agreement. This would never be discussed publicly. Not a statement, not a leak. It would be locked within the firm's most sacred vaults, sealed behind layers of protection only a handful could breach. The monarchy couldn't afford a scandal of this magnitude, not now, not again. Silence wasn't just strategic, it was survival. But silence doesn't mean forgetting. William has already begun shifting the way he thinks, the way he prepares. He looks at his son George, with new eyes, not just as a boy growing into his royal path, but as a future target. One day, he will inherit the crown, and William has no intention of letting history repeat itself. The lessons he's learned, the surveillance, the betrayal, the danger hiding in comfort will be passed down. Not through fear, but through vigilance. Because trust, as William now knows, is a luxury the crown can no longer afford blindly. Sarah Ferguson, for her part, understood the cost. Though never blamed, she has stepped back. Public appearances cancelled, interviews declined. Her withdrawal was voluntary, but it carried the weight of quiet punishment. She would spend the coming years in retreat, rebuilding trust, shielding her daughters, and living with the knowledge that her home, however unknowingly, had been used as a vault for royal surveillance. Meanwhile, behind closed doors, the investigation continues. Under code names, through redacted files, with only a select few granted access, Operation Shadowmantle has evolved. It's no longer just about what was found. It's about ensuring what else may still be hidden, because the truth uncovered at Royal Lodge proved one terrifying fact. If it could happen once, it could happen again. Rumors have already begun circulating among senior royals. Some whisper of a name, a figure from the past whose involvement was never fully investigated. Others question current staff. A few fear the threat was never outside the palace, but still within it. William hears it all. He absorbs every detail. And he watches. Always watching now. Not because he's afraid, but because he refuses to be blindsided again. And as William stared out the palace window once more, one final vow echoed in his mind: never again. Not to my children. Not to my crown. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.